One thing about The Walking Dead is characters die, like, all the time. Sometimes it's as simple as they mess up and a walker gets them, but other times it's a bit more complicated, to the point that fans are debating who should be blamed years after the episode initially aired. Because I like to share my opinion on basically everything, I thought today I'd go through almost every death in the main show and talk about my perspective on who or what is to blame for them happening. Most deaths have multiple factors, so to make it slightly easier, when it comes to assigning blame, I'm going to give each factor a number from 0 to 5 based on how much blame I think it deserves. 5 is most or pretty much all of the blame. 4 is quite a lot of the blame. 3 is some of the blame. 2 is a little of the blame. 1 is ultimately none of the blame, but it's a factor I felt was worth mentioning. And 0 is ultimately none of the blame, and it's a factor that probably wasn't worth mentioning, but the intention of this video is to really run everything back and mention every possible factor, so I'm mentioning it anyways. Let's get into it. The first notable deaths we see in the show are Ed, Amy, and Jim, who all die as a result of a bunch of walkers making their way to the survivors' camp and catching everyone off guard in Season 1, Episode 4, Vatos. I'm straight away going to say that for these deaths, the walkers are getting a 5. Characters just getting kind of unlucky is a thing that happens sometimes, and that's definitely the main factor in this case. Having said that, I'm going to give the group as a whole a 2, because while I don't think you can blame them too much for this, there is, at least in my opinion, something to be said about them maybe getting too relaxed and thinking they were camped out in a safer area than they actually were. I don't think you need to know everything there is to know about the apocalypse to realize that when dead people start walking, you should have people on lookout at all times, especially when just in the previous episode, a walker made it to your camp, and the episode before that, Glenn was speeding around the hills in a loud car, which, while Del probably was right that the car was moving around too much for the walkers to be directed to a specific place, I'm sure it got them moving around a bit more in general and could potentially have caused problems for them. If I was gonna really get picky with things, which I will be doing for this entire video, so strap in, I could also see an argument for putting some blame on Ed for his own death. Ed gets bitten by a walker that rocks up to his tent and starts sniffing around. He sees the shadow of the walker and, thinking it's a person, starts shouting to be left alone. When the walker obviously doesn't listen, Ed pulls the tent open and gets bitten in the neck. You could argue that if Ed wasn't in his tent sulking because Shane beat him up for being an abusive freak, then it's possible Ed wouldn't have gotten bitten in the first place because he would have been with the rest of the group. I'm going to give Ed a 2. The final thing worth mentioning in regard to these deaths is that we see a mini argument between Rick and Shane where Shane says the deaths are actually Rick's fault. Shane's argument is that if Rick, Daryl, T-Dog, and Glenn weren't away from camp searching for Merle and retrieving the guns Rick dropped in the first episode, then less lives would have been lost because there would have been more people there to fight the walkers off. Rick disagrees, saying that actually, if they hadn't left and got back with the guns when they did, then more people, potentially everyone, would have died because they wouldn't have had the resources there to defend themselves. I think Rick and co deserve a 1 here because while I can see where both Rick and Shane are coming from, we will ultimately never know which of them was right. The next and final deaths of Season 1 are in the final episode Wildfire, where Jackie and Dr. Jenner both decide to take their own lives by staying in the CDC while it explodes. Instantly here, I want to give both Jackie and Dr. Jenner a 1 and Walkers a 5 because I think blaming 2 people for wanting to die instead of living in a world full of walkers is a bit messed up, but I also think there could be an argument that Dr. Jenner deserves a little bit more of the blame for Jackie's death because he is the one who made killing themselves in the CDC an option in the first place. Who knows how differently things would have gone for Jackie if she went with the group and had them helping her find reason to live again, and the option to kill herself in a painless instant wasn't right in front of her. I'm going to give Dr. Jenner a 2 for that. In Season 2, Episode 1, What Lies Ahead, the group has to stop on a jammed highway when their RV breaks down. They soon notice a herd of walkers coming their way, so everyone finds somewhere to hide while they pass. Sophia, thinking the coast is clear, starts to move from her hiding spot under a car, but is quickly spotted by 2 walkers. She runs off the highway down into some nearby woods with the walkers and Rick closely behind her. Unable to fight off the walkers and protect Sophia at the same time, Rick gets her to hide under some branches by a creek and tells her not to move until he comes back. He adds that if he doesn't come back, then she should return to the highway, running the way they came and keeping the sun on her left shoulder. When Rick returns to the creek after taking care of the 2 walkers that followed him, Sophia is nowhere to be seen. This leads to a half-season long search and rescue mission that ultimately ends in them discovering a zombified Sophia in the barn of the farm they'd been staying at. Sophia's death is the first major death in the show, and in my opinion can pretty much only be blamed on walkers, which is why they're once again gonna get a 5. The only way you could assign blame to Rick or Sophia is if you purposely ignore the context of the situation. The outbreak is very new to the group still, and Sophia is a terrified child. You can't put blame on Rick for telling Sophia to stay put while he took care of the walkers because that early on they really did need to be careful when dealing with the walkers because they didn't have the skills they go on to have, and he was right that he couldn't just shoot them because more would come. And you can't put blame on Sophia for leaving the spot Rick told her to stay at because ultimately we don't actually know why she ran away, so we can't say she left the spot for no reason. And even if she did leave the spot for no reason, she was just a child. I think it's reasonable to say they both did what they could with the knowledge and abilities they had at the time, and therefore both Rick and Sophia are getting a 1. Otis dies while out on a trip to the local high school with Shane in search for some stuff Carl needs for surgery to save him from a gunshot wound that Otis caused at the end of Season 2, Episode 1. In Season 2, Episode 3, Save the Last One, we see Shane and Otis working together to escape the walkers within the school. When they eventually make it out, it becomes clear that the walkers are closing in on them fast. At first, the pair continue helping each other, but it's not long before Shane turns on Otis, shooting him in the leg and wrestling the supplies off of him. While the walkers catch up to Otis and start tearing into him, Shane limps away with the supplies and makes it back to the farm just in time to help save Carl. There are two obvious factors with this death, Shane and walkers. While Shane ultimately did do the killing, I think it's pretty clear that he wouldn't have done that if the walkers weren't causing them serious issues. Shane didn't seem to have a problem working as a team with Otis until he realised that if he didn't leave Otis to distract the walkers, then not only would Shane die himself, but so would Carl. And as anyone who has watched the show knows, Carl and Laurie are Shane's priority over anything and anyone else. I promise I'm not going to come to this conclusion with every single death in the show, but once again I'm giving walkers a 5. Like I said, if they weren't overrunning the school and causing so many problems for Shane and Otis, I don't believe Shane would have done what he did because there would be no reason to. Having said that, he did do it and it was quite a nasty death, so Shane is getting a 2. Initially I was going to give him a 5 as well, but I do think it's worth taking into consideration that Otis was going to die regardless of if Shane did what he did. And not only that, but Shane would have died himself and in turn so would Carl. Since we're getting nitpicky with it, I could also say that Otis's death was his own fault, since the fact he shot Carl a few episodes prior was the reason they were at the school in the first place. But you know, I'm going to give him a 0 because it was a complete accident. You don't expect there to be a kid hiding behind the deer you're about to shoot. After some drama surrounding finding Sophia in the barn and every walker in the barn getting put down, Herschel leaves the farm to go drink at the local bar he used to frequent. Rick and Glenn go after him, and after a while of trying to convince him to come home, some other people show up. It's not long before these people, Dave and Tony, are asking intrusive questions about where Rick and Co are staying and how many people are in their group and if they can stay with them. Eventually, Dave, realizing Rick isn't going to be as easy to manipulate as he'd hoped, pulls out a gun with the intention of shooting Rick and then the others. Before he can do this, Rick pulls out his gun, shooting Dave first and then Tony too. The obvious conclusion here is that Dave and Tony only have themselves to blame. They came into the situation intending to cause some kind of trouble. I do believe Dave was more in charge than Tony, but I'm gonna just give them both a 5. Rick should probably also be mentioned because he's the one who actually did the killing, but I don't think he deserves any higher than a 1 because it was obviously a self-defense situation. Now, ultimately who Dave and Tony were as people is the reason they got killed, which is why they both got a 5, but if we wanted to be nitpicky, then you could argue that Herschel is also to blame, because even though Shane caused the drama that made Herschel leave the farm, the drama wouldn't have happened if Herschel didn't have such a skewed perspective on what walkers are. Shane and Herschel are both going to get a 0 though. The next, and in my opinion most devastating death in Season 2 is Dale. In episode 11, Judge, Jury, Executioner, we see Dale kind of just wandering the farm at night when he finds a partially eaten cow. Distracted by the cow, Dale gets ambushed by a walker that he tries but ultimately fails to fight off, resulting in the walker ripping open his stomach. The rest of the group come running over and realizing Dale isn't going to make it, Daryl shoots him in the head to stop his suffering. There are two things worth noting with this death. The first is the specific walker that killed Dale. This walker is one we saw earlier in the episode being tormented by Carl. Initially it was trapped in the swamp, but due to Carl messing with it and encouraging it to move around, the walker managed to escape the swamp and wander into the field where it found Dale and bit him. I don't think Carl can be blamed too much for this because while he probably should have known better than to torment walkers, he obviously could never have predicted that this specific thing would happen. I do think giving him a 1 would be too generous though, so I'm going to give him a 2 instead. Ultimately this wasn't his fault, but messing with walkers is still stupid behaviour that he should get a mild amount of blame for, you know? The second thing to consider with this death is the fact that Dale was for some reason wandering around a big field on his own at night. Yes, the farm had been shown up to this point to be quite a safe area, but I don't know, it doesn't feel like the smartest thing a character has ever done, and Dale is, in my opinion, not a stupid guy. He didn't even seem to be patrolling, he was literally just wandering aimlessly. Because Herschel's farm was shown to be relatively safe, I don't think Dale deserves a full 5, but there's no denying that wandering around in the dark during an apocalypse and not keeping your wits about you is foolish behaviour, so he's getting a 3. And then, as a comment, walkers are going to get a 5 because it was a walker that did the killing. In Season 2, Episode 12, Better Angels, Shane takes Randall, a guy the group had been debating the fate of for multiple episodes, out into the woods under the guise of leaving with him to potentially join his old group, the group Dave and Tony were from. Once they're out far enough, Shane turns on Randall, snapping his neck and killing him instantly. I went back and forth with this because while taking someone out into the woods under false pretenses and as part of your plan to also kill your supposed best friend is villain behaviour that deserves a 5, I am of the opinion that killing Randall was ultimately the right choice, so I can't fault Shane for kind of snapping and just getting it done, so Shane is getting a 4. I also think it's worth giving Randall some blame too. If he wasn't with a group of dangerous losers who clearly didn't care about him, then he would never have ended up in that situation in the first place. He's getting a 3. Shane had a lot going on throughout season 2, and pretty much all of it played a part in his ultimate death. There was his love for Laurie and Carl and his need to protect them. There was his jealousy that Laurie rejected him and chose Rick instead. There was the fact he killed Otis. There was him disagreeing with Rick and others on how things should be done and getting more and more frustrated by it. Due to these factors, and probably more I haven't mentioned, season 2 essentially shows Shane slowly losing his mind to the point that in episode 12, Better Angels, he hatches a plan to kill Rick and take his place as leader. The first part of this plan, which I've already spoken about, was to kill Randall. After doing that, Shane bashed his own face into a tree to make it seem like he was in a fight, and then runs back to the group declaring that Randall escaped. Daryl, Glenn, Shane and Rick go on a search for Randall. While out there, Shane convinces the group to split into pairs, Shane of course being paired with Rick. Because Shane is clearly acting strange and agitated, Rick realizes that Shane intends to kill him. Shane tells Rick his plan was to kill Randall and then convince the rest of the group that it was Randall that killed Rick. They have a bit of a back and forth about fatherhood and taking care of Rick's family, and eventually Shane tells Rick to raise his gun so they can end things. Rick refuses to engage, telling Shane that he will have to kill an unarmed man. Rick starts handing his gun over to Shane, but once it's in his hand, Rick pulls out a knife and stabs Shane in the heart, saying, "This is on you, not me. You did this to us, not me." It's pretty clear that mentally Shane was having a tough time for most of season 2, and some of the things causing that were out of his control. It's not his fault he loves his best friend's wife and also she's pregnant with his baby. It's not his fault that the man who runs the farm he's living at insists on keeping walkers in a barn. It's not his fault that the group are taking an age to decide the fate of a guy who is definitely a waste of oxygen. But how he handles all those things is on him. It's no one else's problem that this grown man can't effectively communicate or manage his emotions or remove himself from a situation that's clearly taken a mental toll on him. I can really only give him a 5. Shane's death was absolutely his own fault. And then obviously Rick did the killing, but like the only other option was to let himself get killed, so he can get a 1. Another factor potentially worth mentioning here is that before the group split into pairs on their search for Randall, both Rick and Daryl seem to notice that Shane is being off. Daryl is going to get a 0 here, but you could argue that if both him and Rick had been more on it, then they wouldn't have let Rick go off with Shane on his own, and maybe the outcome of things would have been wildly different. Or maybe not. Shane seemed pretty set in his ways by this point. Jimmy and Patricia are killed in the season 2 finale when the farm gets overrun with a horde of walkers. There's not much else to say about their deaths really. Walkers are once again going to get a 5. Big Tiny is one of the prisoners we meet in season 3 episode 1 Seed, and he dies via a brutal bashing from Thomas, another prisoner we'll talk about in a second, after them and some of our main group are clearing out a cell block and Big Tiny gets scratched by a walker. Obviously Thomas did the actual killing here, but it was the walkers that caused it, so walkers are getting an easy 5. I can't let Thomas off completely though. He can get a 2 purely for being unnecessary brutal and weird with it. We're shown pretty quickly in season 3 episode 2 Sick that Thomas is the most aggressive of the prisoners, his actions getting worse as the episode goes on. One of his first over the top actions is to kill Big Tiny, as I've already gone over, but then he turns his attention to Rick, opening multiple doors when Rick told him not to, which lets a bunch of walkers in, intentionally swinging his weapon too close to Rick and pushing a walker directly into Rick, causing him to fall. He brushes these actions off with a shit happens attitude, but Rick knows better. So once the room they're clearing is sorted, Rick and Thomas stand face to face for a few tense seconds before Rick takes his machete and puts it directly through Thomas's head. It's very obvious Thomas brought this on himself because he was unable to listen and couldn't handle that Rick had more authority than him, so he's getting a 5 and Rick is getting a 1. T-Dog gets bitten in season 3 episode 4 Killer Within when a bunch of walkers enter the courtyard and manages to grab T-Dog as he's trying to close a gate. After the initial bite, he runs into the prison with Carol, and when they come across more walkers blocking their path, knowing he's pretty much dead already, T-Dog charges at them to make room for Carol to get to safety. Once Carol is through, she looks back to see T-Dog being devoured. Obviously T-Dog dies as a result of walkers biting and then eating him, so typically I would just give walkers a 5 and move on, but I think this is a rare occasion where they don't deserve a 5. The reason there were walkers here to bite T-Dog in the first place is because Andrew, one of the prisoners from the first couple of episodes, had been opening gates and luring walkers into different areas of the prison, using deer carcasses as bait, specifically because he wanted to cause trouble for our main group. In terms of my ranking system here, I think Dell's death is a pretty good comparison. Both T-Dog and Dell died because they were bitten by walkers who were where they were because another character had been meddling with them. With Dell's death, the reason I only gave Carl a 2 is because he wasn't meddling with intent, he was just a stupid kid messing around, but in the case of T-Dog's death, Andrew wanted that or something like it to happen, which to me means walkers should get less blame and Andrew should get more. With that being said, walkers are going to get a 3 and Andrew is going to get a 5. The only other factor to consider with T-Dog's death is Rick and the fact Andrew was alive to do all of that meddling in the first place. The last time we saw Andrew was in episode 2 where after Rick killed Thomas, Andrew tried to attack Rick but was ultimately knocked away. Rick ends up chasing him down some corridors and when Andrew runs out into a courtyard of walkers, Rick holds the gate shut and tells him, "You better run." We see Andrew run off, trying to avoid the walkers, and then we hear him screaming, implying to us and Rick that he's been eaten. I went back and forth on this, but I've decided to give Rick a 1 here. I think it's worth mentioning that the reason Andrew is alive is because Rick shut a door on him and hoped the walkers would take care of him instead of having to do it himself, and I'd like to think a version of Rick later in the show would maybe have been a bit less careless and made sure to check himself that Andrew did get caught. But with where we are right now, it makes sense to me that Rick would shut him out, and after hearing the very clear screams that were definitely intended to make us think Andrew was getting eaten, it makes sense to me that he would just walk away believing everything was taken care of. While Rick, Daryl, and Oscar are trying to shut down the prison alarms, Andrew shows himself and reveals to them that it was him who caused all of the chaos. What follows is a scuffle between Andrew, Rick, and Oscar that ends with Oscar holding Rick's gun and pointing it at Rick. Andrew tells Oscar to shoot Rick so they can take back the prison he believes to be theirs, but Oscar turns the gun to Andrew instead, shooting him in the head. Obviously, the only person to blame for Andrew's death is Andrew himself. If it wasn't for the choices he made, he could very easily have become a genuine part of the group like Oscar and Axel both managed for a short time. It's worth mentioning that Oscar did the actual killing, but I'm going to give him a 1 for it and Andrew's getting the full 5. Laurie's death also takes place during episode 4. After Andrew lures the walkers into the prison and sets off a bunch of alarms, the survivors all flee in groups to different areas to try and keep safe. One of these groups is Laurie, Maggie, and Carl, who lock themselves into a section of the prison away from everyone else. It becomes obvious fairly quickly that Laurie is struggling and labor has started. The 3 survivors find a room to lock themselves in, and Laurie tries to give birth naturally, but there's a lot of blood and Maggie is forced to give her a C-section using Carl's knife, and Carl ends up putting Laurie down himself, feeling it was his duty. Laurie's death was a difficult one for me to figure out, because while it's absolutely Andrew's fault that Laurie ended up giving birth on the floor of a prison boiler room instead of in their regular cell block with Herschel there to help her, I think it's very likely Laurie would have died regardless of how qualified the person doing her C-section was. For this reason, I'm giving Andrew a 4 instead of a 5. I'm also going to give Laurie some of the blame here too, because I think getting pregnant in an apocalypse, especially when you're living where Laurie was living, and also had to have your first child via C-section, is genuinely very stupid and embarrassing. I'm not going to give her a full 5, but sorry, she needs to get at least a 4. Oscar dies in Season 3, Episode 8, Made to Suffer, when a Woodbury soldier shoots him in the ribs as the group are about to leave. Obviously, the majority of the blame here will be going to the governor who gave the killing orders and the soldier who did the shooting. I'm straight away going to give them both a 5. But another person worth mentioning here is Rick, who in the midst of this was hallucinating the soldier who shot Oscar as Shane. I think if Rick was more aware of what was actually going on and wasn't distracted by who he thought was Shane with a beard walking towards him in slow motion, then Oscar very likely wouldn't be dead. I can't give Rick too much blame because obviously he was going through some shit at this point in the series, but I am going to give him a 3. Axel was shot in the head by the governor from a distance in Season 3, Episode 10, Home, as the governor and some of his people are pulling up to the prison. There's not much to say about this death. The governor gets a 5. Merle dies in Season 3, Episode 15, This Sorrowful Life, when he takes it upon himself to ambush the governor and his men at a planned meeting spot and gets found by some Woodbury soldiers. The governor tells his soldiers to leave Merle to him. He drags Merle back into the building he was hiding in before he got found and starts beating him. He then chokes him, bites off 2 of his fingers, and breaks his arm. Merle shouts, "I ain't gonna beg, I ain't begging you," and the governor pulls out a gun and shoots Merle in the chest. Later in the episode, Daryl finds Walker Merle and puts him down. I think the obvious factors here are Merle and the governor. I'm going to straight away give the governor the full 5 because he's the entire reason the 2 communities are fighting in the first place. And I think I'm going to give Merle a 4 because while it was obviously very good of him to try and sort things out himself, it was also very stupid. With how well things were going initially with him there on his own, I think if he had waited for a couple of others to show up like Rick and Daryl, they may have been able to keep on top of things and end the drama once and for all. But he didn't because he's a hothead with no patience. Part of me also feels like it's worth mentioning Rick in this situation because the only reason Merle was out and about was because he decided to take it upon himself to hand Michonne over to the governor only to change his mind and go alone. To me, the fact they were genuinely considering doing that to Michonne in the first place is bananas, and if from the beginning Rick was like, he wants me to hand over Michonne but instead we should ambush him, essentially like Merle did anyway but with more people there, things would probably have turned out a lot different for Merle. I know Michonne at some point tells Rick that it's okay and he had to consider handing her over, but I really don't think he did actually. I'm gonna give Rick a 2. Milton, the governor's resident researcher and scientist, dies in Season 3, Episode 16, Welcome to the Tombs. The governor, who has recently captured Andrea, wants Milton to be the one to kill her, but he refuses and instead tries to kill the governor. Unluckily for Milton, the governor easily disarms him, stabs him several times, and then leaves him in the room with Andrea, wanting him to reanimate and kill her. Obviously, the governor gets an easy 5, as he's the one who put them all in that situation in the first place. I think it's worth mentioning that Milton could have just done what the governor said, because if he did, he wouldn't have got stabbed in that moment, but he's only going to get a 1 because I can't blame someone someone for not wanting to kill a person who doesn't deserve it and instead choosing to be brave and try to kill the villain in that situation. I also think it's very likely that if Milton had killed Andrea in that moment, the governor would have killed him anyway at some point. It was kind of a lose-lose for Milton. Like Milton, Andrea dies in the season 3 finale. After the governor leaves them, Andrea manages to free herself with an object Milton had dropped and secretly left for her in the episode, but before she is able to put zombie Milton down, he seals her fate by biting her in the neck. Later on, some of our main group find her and Andrea chooses to end things herself by shooting herself in the head while Michonne sits by her. Once again, this is an obvious the governor gets a 5 situation. He's the only reason any of this is happening. I also think Andrea deserves a tiny bit of blame here, mainly because while she was trying to free herself, she kind of just kept waffling to Milton instead of locking in, and she had the chance to kill the governor a few episodes before this but chickened out, so I'm giving her a 2. Karen and David's charred corpses are revealed to us and Tyrese at the end of season 4 episode 2. We soon find out that it was Carol who killed them, her reason being that they were infected with a sickness that had been going around the prison, and killing them and burning their bodies was the best way to prevent the sickness from spreading even more. I went back and forth on this, but ultimately I think the sickness should get a 5 because it's the only reason Carol did what she did, but Carol needs to get a 4 because taking it upon yourself to kill 2 sick people who very possibly could have got better at some point in the hopes it will prevent the spreading of a disease that is already spreading anyway is, in my opinion, deranged behavior. Like, I don't know how she could have thought that they had just got lucky and Karen and David were somehow the only 2 people in the prison that had the sickness cooking within them. It was just such a stupid idea. The biggest death in season 4 is Herschel, who dies in episode 8, Too Far Gone, after the governor takes him and Michonne hostage and then pulls up to the prison with his new group who are armed with various weapons and machinery, including literal tanks, and tries to get Rick and the other survivors to surrender the prison to them. Rick, having taken on board the wisdom Herschel had spent the season so far feeding him, refuses to let the prison go, telling the governor that it will be difficult but he and all his people are welcome to stay in the prison alongside them. The governor doesn't take kindly to this and, believing Rick to be a liar when he says they can come back from it all, raises Michonne's katana and uses it to partially cut off Herschel's head. Herschel is left bleeding out for a bit while everyone is shooting at each other, but eventually the governor finishes the job with cutting Herschel's head off entirely. Obviously, this is yet another death that is on the governor, so he's getting a 5. There was no way Herschel and Michonne could have predicted the governor was going to appear while they were out doing whatever they were doing, and once they'd been captured it was pretty much over. Herschel's death is overall absolutely on the governor. The only other factor that I can think of with this death is the fact that Rick refused to hand the prison over to the governor, and how that refusal and insistence that things could work out is what caused the governor to kick off the killing. I've gone back and forth on either giving Rick a 1 or a 2 here, because on one hand I'm like, Herschel wouldn't put any blame on Rick. You can see before his death that Herschel is proud that Rick is genuinely offering the governor and his people a place in the prison, but on the other hand, should Rick have known better by this point? When a man who you already know is capable of horrible things shows up at your front door with a tank and 2 hostages and tells you to do one, do you not just listen to them? I find it honourable that Rick offered to let the governor and his people stay at the prison, but I also find it very naive. But maybe that's the point, that spending time being a farmer at the prison kind of blinded him a little bit to the realities of things and made him think the governor would agree, and they all could live, if not happily then at least civilly, together in the prison. There also of course would be the worry of, well, where would they go? If Rick was like, yeah sure, we'll pack up and leave, where actually would they leave to? Rick was being genuine when he said they could live together, but he was also being desperately trying to find a way they could stay in their home. I don't know where I'm going with this really, I just think it's interesting to think about. If Rick had said, okay, take the prison, would that have saved Herschel's life? The governor was shown to be too far gone to live with Rick and his people, but was he too far gone to let Rick and his people leave of their own free will, like he said he would allow them to? Personally, I'm leaning towards he may be willing to let the majority of people go, Herschel included, but eventually he would have seeked out Rick and probably Michonne too and killed them both. The governor dies when Michonne comes at him from behind while he's fighting Rick and puts her katana straight through him, and later his partner Lily finds him and finishes the job by shooting him in the head. Obviously Michonne and Lily did the actual killing, so I'm going to give them both a 1, but we all know that everything that happened to the governor here was his own fault, so he's getting a 5 and I'm glad to be done talking about him. Lizzie and Mika are 2 sisters who we meet in the prison during season 4. Mika, despite being younger, is shown to be the more mature of the 2, and while she's adamant she can never kill a person, she has no trouble killing walkers, and also does well handling her sister's outbursts. Lizzie is the opposite, having a strange love for walkers, becoming distressed at the idea of killing them, but having no problem killing a person, as she doesn't see walkers for what they truly are, so doesn't realise the reality of what killing somebody is. Both Lizzie and Mika die in season 4 episode 14, The Grove. First is Mika, who is killed by her sister in the hopes that seeing a zombie version of Mika will prove prove to Carol and Tyrese that walkers aren't different to people after all. This, of course, doesn't work and results in Carol killing Lizzie via a shot to the back of the head, as she knows that Lizzie's mindset would be near impossible to get her away from and nobody would truly be safe around her. Obviously, Lizzie is the one who actually killed her sister here, which means she has to get an amount of blame, but honestly I'm only going to give her a 1 because I don't think it's fair to blame a child for not being able to cope with living in the kind of world they're in. The main blame here is quite easily the walkers, who are once again getting a 5. I think the only other factor to consider is Tyrese and Carol's parenting skills, as you could argue that the reason Lizzie got to the point that she did is Tyrese and Carol didn't take the bad signs they were seeing seriously. The only reason Lizzie was able to kill Mika and almost kill Judith in the first place is because Tyrese and Carol left the three of them alone to go and get some water. I do, however, believe it's worth noting that whatever was going on with Lizzie would likely have required extensive professional help to fix, and it's wrong to blame Tyrese and Carol for not being able to provide that. So overall, I'm going to give both Tyrese and Carol a 2 for Mika's death because why did they leave the 3 kids alone like that, but a 0 for Lizzie's death because I do think putting her down was the best for everyone, including Lizzie herself. Our final deaths for season 4 and for this part of this Who's to Blame series are the Claimers, a group of nasty violent men who are all killed by Rick, Michonne and Daryl in the season 4 finale after they try to ambush Rick, Michonne and Carl because they want revenge for Rick killing one of them a few episodes ago. Despite the Claimers' reasoning for wanting to kill Rick and the others being revenge for Rick's killing, the Claimers deserved basically everything they got, so Rick, Michonne and Daryl are getting very easy ones and the Claimers themselves are getting a 5. Thank you for watching part 1 of me going through almost every Walking Dead death and assigning blame. I will be back with part 2 where we'll go through seasons 5 to 7 very soon.